What's up? You have accessed Renegade Files, your covert connection to unsolved mysteries, conspiracy analysis, and paranormal adventure. Together we go deep into the worlds of high strangeness. I'm your host, Lex Gordon, broadcasting this pirate radio transmission from the Jungle Villa Outpost, deep in the uncharted tropics. This is Renegade Files episode 125, World's Fairs, Part 1, Impossible Timelines and Resetting History. The World's Fairs, also called World Expositions, took place in many cities worldwide from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s. These were enormous events in every way, physically, logistically, and attendance-wise. For example, the 1893 Chicago's World's Fair, officially known as the World's Columbian Exposition, covered 690 acres, featured canals, lagoons, 200 neoclassical buildings, and lasted from May 1st to October 31st, 1893. It attracted 27,300,000 visitors at a time when the entire population of the USA was 63 million. And this was just one of such events that took place in all the major cities globally across the same very short span of time. When these elaborate, costly events were over, the buildings and grounds were destroyed, scraped, and bulldozed flat. But as modern researchers look back on the photos and records, the timelines and scale of construction simply fail to add up. Today, we will explore the details of the fairs, their size, constructions, and components compared to the official stories of when, how, and why they were built. I had initially planned to make this one episode about the entire subject, but was quickly overwhelmed with the information and scope of the narratives. So I'm making this part one of a series, with follow-up episodes coming in sequence until we can cover it all. This is an amazing topic, and it pulls the ancient advanced civilization hypothesis right up into the Victorian era. On this special episode, we will explore the official construction narratives of the Victorian World's Fairs, summarize the timelines and locations of these many worldwide events, analyze the photographic record of their construction and demolition, and try to understand two things. How do the official stories of these events clash so harshly with the physical and logistical realities? And two, why would such a drastic diversion of narrative be necessary? In the following episodes, so World's Fairs Parts 2 and maybe Part 3, I'm not sure yet, we'll look at the destruction and dismantling of these fairs, what was left behind for us to analyze, and the theories about what could possibly be the alternative narratives that make more sense than the combination of photographic and historical records we have for these official stories. So come along, and together we'll delve into one of the most shocking of modern theories on Renegade Files episode 125, World's Fairs Part 1, Impossible Timelines and Resetting History. So I'm not going to divide this show into parts, but I am going to start with an introduction to the World's Fairs, what they were, essentially. World's Fairs are something that most of us may remember from school or in stories from our grandparents, which came from things that they were taught in schools. I recall looking at some old photos of a World's Fair in a reference-only book in the library as a kid. For the Gen Zers, a library was like a building where the internet was on paper, and a reference book was a big three-dimensional Kindle app with pictures that you could look at but not take home. We grew up learning that the World's Fairs were big events that took place a long time ago. They were made to show the triumphs and the future of the budding industrial age, and us Florida kids imagined them to be sort of like an old-timey temporary Epcot. Over the centuries, since the time of the big World's Fairs of the late 1800s and early 1900s, these events, for the most part, have been merely glanced at and chatted about briefly, if that, and for the majority, they're just a footnote about something that people did ages ago, and looking into them mostly stops there. So let's dig into the facts that we do know about these events as we start to paint a more clear picture of exactly why so much of their history has been brought into question recently. I thought to include a chronological list of the World's Fairs, all of them, but there are far too many to list. There are literally hundreds, and all around the world, and in a short period of time. So here's just a few. 1791, Prague, Bohemia, the first industrial exposition on the occasion of the coronation of Leopold II, King of Bohemia, referred to as a considerable sophistication of manufacturing methods. In 1798, Paris, France, the Exposition of French Industry and Products. Multiple expositions were held in France until 1827. In 1829, the American Institute Fair in New York. Again in 1829, the Turin, Piedmont, Sardinia, Prima Triennale Publica Exposition dell'Anno. Then they had a second one in 1832. Then they had the National Agricultural, Industrial, Commercial, and Applied Arts Expositions in Piedmont, Sardinia in 1838, 1844, 1850, and 1858. Keep in mind, these are enormous events. We'll get into exactly how enormous when we dive into a few of them specifically. So then we have the French Industrial Exposition, that was in 1834. We had one in Vienna, 1873, Philadelphia, 1876, Paris, 1878, Barcelona, Spain, 1888. Again in Paris, 1889, this is when the Eiffel Tower was installed. Chicago, 1893, that's probably the biggest. St. Louis, 1904, Portland, 1905, Seattle, 1909. Over a period of about 60 years, 13 countries produced exhibition architecture of staggering economic, physical, and material scale. I can't stress enough how elaborate and enormous these events were. And the buildings at all of these World's Fairs, and many, many others that I didn't list, hundreds, all look the same. Compare one fair to another, regardless of where they are and who designed them, who built them, across continents and oceans. North America, Russia, Western Europe, all at the same time and all the same classical architecture, the same staggering scale, the same elaborate ornamentation. Corinthian columns, three-dimensional carved statues worked into the walls, the window frames and the rails, enormous copper domes, internal railway systems, fountains, ponds, moving sidewalks and canal systems. And this isn't just a case of looking at old buildings and wondering how'd they do that back then. So let's look a bit deeper into just one of these exhibitions, the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. At the time, the Chicago World's Fair was home to the largest building on Earth, built on a site that covered 660 acres of swampland. That's the entire fair, not the building. But the fair consisted of over 200 buildings, all supposedly built in the span of 30 months. The buildings altogether enclosed 14 million square feet indoors. The New York Times called it the most beautiful assemblage of buildings in human history. The main architect, Daniel Burnham, was celebrated as one of the most gifted and accomplished architects and large-scale project planners the Earth had ever produced. But when analyzing the construction photos, a few glaring things stand out as improbable. The photos show buildings at advanced stages of completion. Scaffolding surrounding facades with fully intact windows, carvings completed, and fabric awnings deployed and casting shade on concrete sidewalks with lampposts, planters, park benches, and fountains. And over, in photo after photo, hardly a soul visible. These construction pictures show enormous buildings that dwarf the people who we do see in them. And when I say people, I mean like 4 or 5 people total, mostly men in suits and top hats, just standing around looking at the camera. It's ghostly. Where are the thousands of men it must have taken to build these buildings so quickly? Where are the wagons, the carts, and the materials? Over and over, we see none. And if we do see material, it's stacks of wood, lumber. Yet these buildings are stone. They look like stone. They tell us the buildings were wood frames covered in hemp and plaster. But look at the demolition photos. Enormous piles of stone. Granite boulders in heaps. Giant collections of marble slabs. And the building construction sequences we find show leaps of construction finishing that should have taken months, sequenced in photos separated by mere weeks. And every time, with hardly a single workman visible. The official narrative is that the dates were misapplied, or that the speed of construction was driven by schedules and timelines. But there's another possibility, that these scaffolds we see erected around what look like finished buildings were cleaning structures, and the buildings were being cleaned and replastered rather than constructed, and the photos that show the skeletons of the buildings or their missing components were actually the later photos of the building's deconstruction, disassembly, and dismantling. This would explain both a lack of builders in the photos and the lack of building materials we see. Tap follow real quick where you're listening to stay connected and help the show thrive. Thank you. The interior of the manufacturer's building at the 1893 World's Fair, that's the one in Chicago, was the largest building in the world at the time. That building covered a total of 31 acres. The massive scale of this architectural wonder was difficult for many visitors to comprehend. The U.S. Capitol building, the Great Pyramid at Giza, the Winchester Cathedral, Madison Square Garden, and St. Paul's Cathedral in London could all easily fit inside the ground area covered by this single Chicago World's Fair building, and I mean all of them at once and with room to spare. If you went into the manufacturer's building on Monday morning and walked a fast 4 miles an hour, 3 miles an hour is average walking speed, but at a walk of 4 miles per hour for 10 hours a day, you wouldn't walk all the aisles of that building until 9 full days later, sometime on Tuesday of the following week. If you decided to walk through that building and spent 3 minutes at each of the exhibits inside, it would take 21 months to see it all. This is with spending 10 hours a day and 6 days a week to explore that one building alone. 21 months it would take you. This building and 199 others covered 600 acres, and they were connected by sidewalks that moved, lakes, canals, and bridges, all lit with electricity. And this is 15 years before the Model T. And yet, the entire Chicago World's Fair was only open for 6 months. Then, in 1894, 1 year after the fair closed, the entire 200 buildings of the Chicago World's Fair burned down by accident and was bulldozed down on purpose. We are told that homeless people living in the buildings accidentally burned them down. The city then deployed hundreds of workers to demolish the remaining structures to the ground. The Palace of Fine Arts, which now houses the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago, is one of the few buildings, I think one of two, that survived the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. The story is that for some reason, this building was built upon a brick foundation, so unlike the other fair buildings, they could save it. They say that they liked it so much that they rebuilt the temporary wood and plaster building with limestone just because it was so cool. This is a simplification, of course. It took a few tries and a few $1,000,000, but the reality is, despite its staggering scale and beyond beautiful proportions, design and construction, it paled in comparison to some of the other buildings that they did destroy. So this is the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. You can look it up in a Google image search real quick and see it for yourself. Does that look like a temporary structure? Not only that, when you look at this building and compare it to the one shown in the World's Fair photos, it is identical. If they did actually rebuild it in the stone we see today, then just doing that is one of the greatest architectural and building feats the world has ever known. Another building, the World's Congress Auxiliary Building, also remains standing there. This is now the Art Institute of Chicago, and postcards of this exact building from 1903 show it looking extremely out of place, standing utterly alone along the dirt road that was Michigan Avenue at the time. But you can see pictures of this building and all the others fronted by paved roads, tiled sidewalks, and stone bridges for the fair. I guess they dug up the paved roads around these monumental feats of architecture and scale and replaced them with the mud roads they had before just to make life more difficult. Have you ever lived in a place where a dirt road was paved? Quite possibly. I certainly have. Have you ever seen a public street that was paved, dug back out and made into a dirt road again? Hardly. None of this makes any sense. Building literal cities just to tear them down? And we are far more of a disposable, throwaway society now than we were back then. Arguably, as much so today as humanity has ever been. When my great aunt passed away, we cleaned out her house and found boxes of Bic lighters that were out of fuel that she had kept. There was no way to refill them, and they were worthless. Yet she was from a generation that simply couldn't imagine throwing something like that away. It was plastic and metal and had formerly had so much utility. There must be some way to fix it. And the generation before hers would have been far more like that. At the time of the World's Fairs, women would save the cotton sacks that flour came in and use them to make dresses, curtains, diapers. To them, those bags were perfectly good cotton fabric. Why would anyone throw something like that away? This was a time when men would salvage the lumber from an old wooden bridge being rebuilt and use it to build a hay barn. And yet, we built dozens of these exhibitions. Hundreds, actually, with ornately carved columns on thousands of enormous buildings, surrounded by canals and reflecting ponds, and lit with electric lights, and populated with cafes, fountains, restaurants, and streets. We used them for 3 or 4 months and then just demolished them all down to flat dirt. We dug up the paved streets around the buildings we did keep and graded dirt roads back around them so we could step through the mud to get into the museum. None of it makes any sense. It seems like the old architecture that was marble and copper and covered arcs and enclosed spaces was set aside in some kind of great reset so we could lay claim to the construction of modern civilization. The University of Chicago's alma mater mentions the World's Fair, and it refers to the removal of the previous buildings and their replacement with the new city in the lines, quote, The city white hath fled the earth, but where the azure waters lie, a nobler city hath its birth, the city gray that never shall die. The Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building at the Chicago World's Fair could hold 300,000 people, and the exterior alone was lit with 10,000 electric lights. At the same exposition, every state had its own building, most of them at least 100,000 square feet. 200 buildings on 600 acres, all built in 30 months. And that's the conservative estimate. Some sources list the building time as short as 24 months. The timeline of construction does not match the photographic and architectural records. Look at those photographs. You can see them in the Dark Intel files on Patreon. You can find them online. They will shock and dismay you. Look at the photographs of the Chicago World's Fair and tell me those are temporary buildings built in 2 years and made to be torn down. It just doesn't add up. So the timeline of construction doesn't add up, even if the buildings were wood and plaster, which they certainly don't look like. And the ones that are left behind absolutely are not. And we'll get into it more deeply in the next episode in this series, but the demolition photos also fail to match the wood and plaster story. At every World's Fair, it took far longer to demolish and remove the buildings than it took to build them, and this is never the case. And without exception, the vast majority of these structures created for these fairs were destroyed. And yes, there was public outcry. People were furious about it. They tried to stop it, and in a very few cases, as I've mentioned, some buildings were saved. The Louisville, Kentucky Exposition of 1884 only ran from August 16, 1884 to October 25, 1884, less than 3 months. And yet it covered 45 acres, and its largest building alone encompassed 13 acres. That entire World's Fair only took, according to the official records, several months to a year to build. So they're not even exactly sure how long it took, but max a year, and that includes clearing the land and the earthworks and landscaping and building out what was, at the time, one of the largest electrical systems in the country, and then, in 3 months, tore it all down. Gone. We also have the Trans-Mississippi Exposition of 1893. This World's Fair covered 180 acres. Photos of its gigantic buildings stretching into the distance and reflected by enormous lakes and streams and surrounded by paved walkways with stone railings look like photos of an enormous European city. They built it in 12 months and destroyed it back to flat earth as soon as the fair closed. The Centennial Exposition in Nashville, Tennessee, 1897, covered 117 acres, built in 2 years. California held 3 World's Fairs, a 200-acre event with hundreds of grand buildings, 1894. The 636-acre Panama Pacific International Exposition in 1915, and the Golden Gate International Exposition of 1939, that covered 400 acres on an island they built, all of it done in about a year. Today, in California, you can't even get a permit to build a house in 1 year. Paris threw a World's Fair in 1889. This is when they built the Eiffel Tower, a structure we do know they built at the time. The fair took 3 years of planning and building, and the designing and construction of the Eiffel Tower took essentially that entire time. And it is the tallest, but definitely not the most elaborate or ornate of the buildings on this 500-acre fair, filled with shocking architecture, carvings, domes, and on and on. And this is a good time to mention again the fact that this episode is very visual. If you want the full impact of what I'm saying, if you've ever wondered what cool things and bonus episodes and extra content I've made for you in the RFA agency on Patreon, now is the time to sign up for a totally free week and see all of the dark intel files, especially the one for this episode, because you can see all of these shocking photos for yourself in one place. Look at them and tell me these buildings are temporary. Me saying these buildings don't look temporary does not do it justice. When you see these pictures of the buildings at these World's Fairs, your immediate, visceral reaction is, yeah, forget that. No way is that wood and paper mache and built in 12 months. Just look at the pictures. It's impossible that this is what we're looking at here. And as long as I'm on a slight rant, let me also get into something else that becomes extremely disturbing as you analyze the photographic records of this topic. And I've mentioned it briefly in the beginning. Where are the people? Two things. When you look at the photos of the supposed construction of these astounding buildings, you see, at most, 3 or 4 men in top hats and tailcoats, standing around looking at the camera. Where are the thousands of men it would take to build these largest buildings on Earth at the time in 30 or 23 or in some cases 12 months? Where are the carts and the materials? Where is the manpower? Not there. Time and time again, these construction photos have maybe a handful of people in them, and many of them, not a soul is visible. Then the second thing is, when you dig really deep and analyze the photos of the opened fairs populated with these millions of people, the Chicago World's Fair alone saw 27.3 million visitors. But when you look at the pictures of the populated fair, you see that many of these people are actually illustrations. Look closely. They're scratched in, drawn in, and cut from other photos and pasted in. And not just the people. You can find trees in one picture that appear in other places in the fair in a different picture. The same exact tree, same branches and leaves. And other elements too, such as lampposts that show different types of bulbs, shades, and posts in varying photos of the same building or bridge. These are supposed to be the same exact lampposts, yet in 3 different photos, they look like 3 different lampposts. And when you look closely, you realize that they have actually been illustrated into these photographs. And when I say illustrated, I mean drawn by hand, painted in. And so this is why the same lamppost in front of the same building will look different in 3 different photographs, because some artist at some point has drawn the lamppost in, and they've done it in 3 different ways, because probably 3 different people did it. Barely different ways, yes, but different nonetheless. And this happens with other things like statues, bridge railings, and flagpoles. It's just weird. To rock some weird Renegade Files merch, follow the merch link in the show notes and grab some underground gear. Thank you. So, this moves us into another part of this analysis. Why then? Why set up, then destroy all of these World's Fairs in the compressed time frame, simultaneously and around the world? Basically, from the late 1800s until the early 1900s. I thought about it a lot as I was making this episode, and something struck me. And this is the fact that the timing of all of these World's Fairs, what amounts to the late 1800s, coincides with 2 other critical junctures of modern Western civilization. The first of these was the Industrial Revolution. Many people have pointed this out. Ironically, most of the World's Fairs had the express goal of showcasing the miracles of the Industrial Age to the public at large. Beginning in Great Britain around 1760, the Industrial Revolution had spread to continental Europe and the United States by about 1840. Economic historians agree that the Industrial Revolution is one of the most important events in human history. comparable only to the adoption of agriculture with respect to material advancement. This transition included going from hand production methods to machines, new chemical manufacturing and iron production processes, the increased use of water power and steam power, the development of machine tools, and the rise of the mechanized factory. Because of this, output greatly increased, and the result was an unprecedented rise in wealth for a handful of industrialist pioneers, as well as the bankers who financed them. In many cases, these were the same people. The world's fairs all came along at the same time that the impacts of the Industrial Revolution were expanding globally. Then we have a second event. And I'm sure other people who looked into this have thought of this too, but it came to me as an original thought within the research at the time. The second event to coincide with the rapid development, deployment, and just as rapid destruction of the world's fairs was the development and emerging widespread adoption of a new technology, the photograph. The earliest attempts at photography took place around 1800, and the first surviving permanent photograph was created in 1826. The daguerreotype was invented by Louis Daguerre in 1839 and was the first commercially successful photographic system, and it could capture images in minutes. In July 1888, the Eastman Kodak camera went on the market. It was affordable to a large percentage of the population, and the process allowed the user to take multiple photographs onto film and then have the film processed into prints by a chemist, usually charged a fee for the service by a local drugstore, and some photographers had the equipment themselves, and so widespread photography was at the doorstep of the world. It was in this same time period that the world's fairs, to use a modern phrase, became a thing. An argument could be made that those at the helm of the worldwide Industrial Revolution, which also happened to coincide with the westward expansion of the United States population, aligned their own self-interests with an obliteration of any advanced civilization existing in the past, because the narrative that best suited their future success was that of the industrial age being a call to action for the masses to go forth and build the greatest civilization the earth had ever known. Remember that the Smithsonian Institute had a very large impact on this ideal, with their propagation of what they called manifest destiny, which sidelined any previous civilization as decidedly primitive, and set forth in the public mind the concept that an indigenous population must be inferior to the advancing European descendants and developed nations, because if they were not, and if their culture was worth preserving, then God would have given them the technology and the organizational means to stop the developing world from obliterating them. And so the destiny of the modern man to overtake and subjugate them must be a destiny manifested by God, manifest destiny. And this is absolutely not my opinion, but it is the position of the Smithsonian Institute in the 1800s. To uphold this idea, any and all evidence of a previously advanced civilization that may have preceded the grandeur of the emergent industrial age had to be erased from the history and from the terrain. As soon as the ability to take photographs started to become widespread, all of a sudden, every major city in the world held a World's Fair, claimed to have built thousands of the largest buildings on Earth within months, at sites which covered hundreds of acres, showcased these astounding classical buildings briefly, then systematically destroyed them. As many as 1,500 buildings from various world fairs were destroyed after the events concluded. And here's another thing I've noticed in the research. Without exception, all of these buildings at all of these World's Fairs around the world all look the same. All enormous, classical, Greco-Roman type architecture created on a giant scale. At every city, in every country, at hundreds of different world fairs over and over, the large and ornate architecture all looks exactly the same. If the World's Fairs were meant to showcase the emerging grandeur and triumph and glory of the new, fantastic, futuristic industrial age, why then would they all, without exception, and across the world, build these expositions to reflect the ancient classical architecture of centuries ago? It's interesting because this exact question had to be addressed, because apparently so many people have asked it over the ages. The Smithsonian tells us that the World's Fairs often incorporated classical architecture to evoke a sense of timelessness and grandeur, linking modern achievements to historical greatness. This design choice aimed to inspire confidence in progress while celebrating cultural heritage, creating a visual narrative of continuity between the past and the future. We read exactly that on the Smithsonian website. That all sounds very sophisticated, but it rings very much like a politician who can talk for 5 minutes without ever actually answering the question you ask. In addition to that, it frankly, once again, makes no logical sense. It doesn't make any sense to try to inspire confidence in the future and in progress by creating a visual narrative that celebrates the timelessness and grandeur of the classical architecture of antiquity. And let's just say, for instance, that one World's Fair did apply these same intellectual gymnastics to arrive at this idea that building ancient classical architecture was the best way to bring people aboard with the idea of a futuristic industrial revolution. That would still only be one World's Fair. What are the chances that hundreds of World's Fairs and the creation of literally thousands of buildings, some of them to this day the largest buildings ever built on Earth, were all, city after city, country after country, created based on this same exact illogical methodology and aesthetic? The entire thing defies logic, and the narrative falls apart. And not just the official narrative of how and how fast these buildings were built, but also the narrative for the reason they were made in the style and scale that we see. This brings me to the last section of part 1 of this series. Right before I get into that, though, I do want to mention one thing. I mentioned that it's ironic, more so than ironic, that the Industrial Revolution comes about right at the time that photography starts to become accessible and widespread. And so as soon as people can afford and technically take photographs wherever they go, we have all these world fairs, we put these buildings up, display them as something we've created, and then bulldoze them and get rid of them, because the photograph had all of a sudden become ubiquitous, or was on the doorstep of becoming ubiquitous. One thing I want to mention is, back in those days, if you didn't go to a city, you didn't know what that city looked like. It wasn't like now. You didn't have TV. For the most part, you didn't even have a newspaper from somewhere else. You could. And there were photographs in newspapers before everyone had a camera. But my point is, in the Victorian era, we have to remember also, the Victorian era was also the Wild West in America. I always thought that was such a cool juxtaposition, but it's true. So the point is, in the American Wild West, which was also the Victorian age, so this is the era of these world fairs when they're sort of starting to come to pass, you could rob a bank in one town, and if you could get away to the point where you could ride your horse to another town without anyone knowing where you went, or actually following you the whole way in hot pursuit. If you could arrive at the next town, you could get away with robbing the bank at the previous town completely scot-free, and all you had to do was make up a different name when you got there. I mean, really, think about that. You could ride into a town, and someone would say, "Who the heck are you?" And you could say, "My name is James Hinkle. I'm from back east. I was a cattle farmer. My wife died in a tree trimming accident, and I was so sad I rode out here to make a new life." And the innkeeper would be like, "Well, welcome, James. Have a seat." I mean, there was no ID. There was no. You might have had a paper from the army if you were a soldier with some writing on it that said who you were, but the whole thing was very, let's just say, loose regard to identity. And the point is that wasn't the only thing that was flexible like that. Your backstory could be made up, your name. People changed their name all the time. It was a common thing in the Wild West. It's just part of the whole entire story here. That the fact that, we think of everything being so connected. We can go on Google Earth and look at the buildings, but there wasn't anything like that back then. Hardly. Not even a photograph of another town would you see. I mean, it's just, we have to remember what this era was like. It was, in our modern sensibilities, primitive. Absolutely, the communication was. Now, there was documentation and there were cities, and I'm not saying that every building in the World's Fair was found every time they dug it up out of the mud, although that is a theory. But it's interesting that the advent of the photograph and the Industrial Revolution coincided with the rapid construction and destruction of these elaborate buildings. That's all I'm saying, right? Okay. Way back. Okay, way back. This is way back. This brings me to the last section of this part 1 of this series. And let me just say before we get into that one more thing I wanted to mention. So, I went over this idea that the Industrial Revolution comes about right about the same time that photography starts to become accessible and widespread, and that right at that time we have these world fairs which destroy all this architecture. Okay, it's ironic. We also have to remember that at this time, so let's just say the Victorian era, which also coincides to the Wild West in America. I always thought that was a cool little juxtaposition, but it's true nonetheless. So in the Wild West at the time, so the expansion of the westward frontier, back in those days, if you robbed a bank in one town and were able to get away to the point where you could ride your horse to the next town without anyone seeing where you went, you could show up in that next town having completely gotten away with robbing a bank in the previous town just by telling them that your name was different. People change their name all the time back then. We don't really think about it in those terms, but if you read some American Western history, it's absolutely the case. There's a scene in The Good, the Bad, the Ugly where Tuco comes across Angel Eyes in the prisoner of war camp, and Angel Eyes says, "Why are you going by the name Bill Carson now?" And Tuco says, "One name is as good as another." And I bet you don't tell him that your name is, Captain Angel Eyes, because, that being his nickname. Anyway, it's just interesting that identity was something that was way more malleable and flexible back then. You could show up in a new town. You don't have to be a bank robber. If you just want a different life, ride to the next town and change your name. Tell them your name is something else and that your wife died in a tree trimming accident back east and you came out here to make a new life, and the innkeeper would say, "Well, what can I get you, buddy?" I mean, that was it. It wasn't like now. They didn't have Google Earth. They didn't have a newspaper from every town in every other town. If you wanted to see what a town looked like, you had to go there. If you didn't, you had no idea. And so when the camera came out, all that changes. And now people have the ability to travel somewhere, take a photograph, bring it back. It's a new world. Right? And it's ironic that with the invention of the photograph and the widespread sort of the emerging adoption of making that technology sort of accessible and widespread, that right then is when we have all these world fairs at all these major cities, and the end result of all of them is tearing down this what looks like ancient architecture. I know it's crazy, but it's crazy nonetheless. So anyway, yes, this brings us to the last section in this part one, which is ultimately comes down to this. If these World's Fairs weren't made as part of a great reset to erase the advanced civilizations of the past and replace them with the worker bee nations required to build the future through the industrial revolutions, and thus make the robber barons and the banker elite rich beyond measure, then there must have been some other reason to pour what amounts to billions of dollars of resources and manpower into construction projects around the world at a time when housing and natural resources were needed for the very survival of the species. Surely these enormous expositions drew fantastic crowds and generated millions of dollars for their local economies, and that would be a good reason to do it, I guess. Well, it turns out not so much. Once again, without exception, the productions of the giant World's Fair expositions lost millions of dollars, every single one of them. The St. Louis Fair lost today's equivalent of $250 million. The Philadelphia Exposition declared bankruptcy. The Berlin World's Fair lost $2 million, and over these extravagant events lost millions and millions of dollars and ended up in financial ruin and bankruptcy, with vendors and contractors and staff going unpaid and financially ruined themselves. And then all of the infrastructure, buildings, bridges, canals, and electrical grids built for these expositions burned down, torn down, and demolished. Entire cities demolished on purpose, at a time when housewives saved milk bottles to can peaches in, and made clothes from the bags that the flour came in. So this wraps it up at this point. And when we come back next time, we'll dive into the process and timeline of the demolition of some of these World's Fairs, to analyze those photographs and see how they align with what we are told was the construction of these buildings. We'll also go deep into some of the theories that point toward an alternative of events to explain exactly what's going on here. So you don't want to miss it, because it gets crazy. Be sure to hit follow or subscribe on the podcast app you're listening with right now, so we can meet here next week and figure this out together. If you enjoy these investigations and want to help keep this independent show alive, join the Renegade Files Agency on Patreon and unlock exclusive agent-only bonus episodes, the Dark Intel Files, and secret dispatches. If you believe in digging deeper and keeping truth alive, then join me at patreon.com/renegadefiles. There's a link in the show notes, and become an agent today. For less than you tip a pizza guy, you can help me keep doing this. And thank you. If you're already an RFA agent, you make this show possible. Thank you sincerely for investigating World Fairs Part 1, impossible timelines, and resetting history with me. Subscribe or follow the show now, so together we can meet here next time and explore the deepest covert stories of UFOs, aliens, hauntings, cryptids, conspiracy theories, and unsolved mysteries. I am so glad to have you in the Renegade Files crew. Right now is the best time to tap the Patreon link in the show notes. Do that and come check out everything I've made for you there. I'll see you inside. Until our next adventure, I'm your host, Lex Gordon. Stay wild, nomadic child.